Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What role can international trade agreements play to help create employment opportunities and also to improve the quality of life in various countries? What can be done to help businesses to make sure that they have a level playing field and don't have to become involved in a race to the bottom? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at international trade agreements and the role they can play in helping to provide economic employment opportunities as well as to improve the quality of life and the standard of living in countries around the world. My guest today is an expert on these international trade agreements. My guest today is Dr. Joshua Meltzer. Dr. Joshua Meltzer is a fellow in global economy and development at the Brookings Institution, and he's an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Dr. Meltzer is a regular commentator in international print media and on television news media outlets. Dr. Meltzer has an SJD and an LLM from the University of Michigan Law School in Ann Arbor and law and commerce degrees from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Josh Meltzer, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's just start off right at the very beginning and talk about international trade agreements. What exactly, when we talk about international trade agreements, are we talking about? Are there various types of agreements?
Well, look, great question. And trade agreements can be in different types and different forms. Generally, when we talk about trade agreements, we're talking about treaty-level commitments between governments that deal with a range of what we consider to be trade issues. Traditionally, this was always about trying to reduce tariffs at the border, which is the tax, essentially the rate that governments would apply to imports. And over many decades, in fact, since the end of World War II, there's been a lot of success in using trade agreements to reduce tariffs. These trade agreements have been done in the form of large multilateral negotiations involving many nations, and this has culminated in what's called the World Trade Organization. And that success has now meant that trade agreements now increasingly focus on what we refer to as behind the border barriers to trade or non-tariff barriers, and this can be any type of law or regulation which can have an impact on trade. Traditionally this might be things like standards which determine how production is done. It might be what we call SPS measures which deal with food and health safety. It might be as diverse as telecommunications policy, competition policy, and so a lot of this now gets discussed in the context of trade agreements.
I see. So we're talking about agreements amongst or between countries and groups like that. What are some of the advantages of international trade agreements? Do they help promote the free flow of goods and services? You mentioned breaking down barriers, tariff barriers, those types of things. What are some of the advantages? And then we'll talk about maybe some of the disadvantages too. I'm sure there's a downside.
Yeah. So I guess the one point that you highlight in your question, which I think is worth emphasising, is that this is now about goods and services. And so traditionally we've always been focused on reducing barriers to trade in goods, and now increasingly there's an appreciation of how important services are, not only for economic growth, but also increasingly that services can be traded across borders. So barriers to reducing barriers to goods and services are also certainly important. What's been well understood by economists for a long time is that barriers to the movement of goods and services essentially create more costs to an economy than they do benefits. So the economic argument has always been, in fact, that countries should unilaterally, on their own, liberalise their own markets because they're going to be much better off with a liberalised, open economy than they are with a closed economy. A closed economy is simply going to protect particular industries. It's going to remove competition from the market, which is going to reduce the efficiency and the productivity of the economy. It's going to lead to misallocation of resources and overall reductions in welfare. So the question is necessarily asked, if countries are better off unilaterally reducing their barriers, why do they need trade negotiations? And this is where political economy comes into it, because we know that protected industries have a strong incentive to organise politically to maintain that protection. And essentially, trade negotiations provide an opportunity for exporters to increase their market share in other markets. And so it essentially creates an offsetting incentive for export-orientated industries to organise and to push for these types of market access opportunities. And so you get an offsetting political pressure, essentially, which can counterbalance the otherwise protectionist interest which tends to dominate. So you essentially need these trade negotiations to overcome the status quo, which would be you would remain sort of protectionist, protecting particular industries. And so this leads then to the observation, which I think is quite crucial when we think about trade, which is that we talk a lot about trade negotiations and trade agreements in terms of providing new market access opportunities, and that's certainly an important part of trade agreements. But it remains the case that the economic benefits really accrue to the country doing the liberalising. It is not through the new export opportunities where most of the economic gains lie. It's actually through the types of economic reforms that the country undertakes domestically as a result of its commitments in these trade agreements, which actually provide the most economic benefits.
It certainly does. And you mentioned, before we get into some, we're going to look at some specific trade agreements. You mentioned the World Trade Organization, WTO, which now is part of the United Nations system, as I recall. It's one of the UN agencies. What exactly, briefly, is the World Trade Organization?
So the World Trade Organization evolved from what was previously called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The WTO came into effect in 1995, and it currently has 253 members, so most of the largest economies and trading nations in the world. It's an international organisation. It's situated in Geneva. It is the set of rules and commitments that countries have made to essentially liberalise their economies and to trade amongst each other. The WTO really is premised on two key principles, which are referred to as most favoured nation and national treatment. Most favoured nation is essentially a commitment that all members of the WTO have made to treat every other WTO member equally. So if you provide a benefit to one WTO member, you are committed to extend that benefit to all other WTO members. The national treatment commitment is a commitment not to treat your domestic producers more favourably than foreign producers. So if you want to extend a benefit to a particular good, you have to treat the imported good the same way. And these are essentially principles of non-discrimination, and it is what underpins the commitments in the WTO. The WTO also, importantly, in addition to being a repository of the rules, has a dispute settlement function. And in fact, it is probably the most effective international dispute settlement mechanism that exists, certainly more effective than the International Court of Justice or any of the other sort of ad hoc international arbitrary tribunals. It comprises of what's called a panel and an appellate body, which is essentially a court and an appeals court. It is set up at the WTO, and it allows countries to essentially litigate claims that another country is not complying with its WTO commitments. It's been very effective. It's produced a very significant body of law, and it is the decisions of the panel and the appellate body are more or less complied with by most countries most of the time. And third and finally, the WTO is also a negotiating forum. So it is where members of the WTO come to negotiate further reductions in their trade barriers, and we are currently in a very long-running trade negotiation called the Doha Round.
Why don't we, that's a good entree right into that, a good segue into it. Why don't we talk about the Doha Round for a moment? What exactly is it? We read a bit about it. It seems like it has fits and starts. It's up one day, down the next day. What is the Doha Round, and what is the purpose of bringing these countries together to focus on these trade issues?
Sure. So the Doha Round was launched in Doha in 2001, 13 years ago. And it is what's called a multilateral trade round, where it's essentially a range of areas where countries agree that they will negotiate reductions in their barriers. It's extensive from goods, services, agriculture, intellectual property dispute settlement. It's across a range of areas. And the idea of a multilateral round is that you agree to do everything or you don't do anything. There's no where you pick it apart and do one bit and only one bit, which makes these deals very difficult because they are very broad-reaching. They are very extensive when they can be done. They require trade-offs across a whole range of interests, so they are very complicated and traditionally have gone on for an extended period of time. But I think there's certainly a view now that the Doha Round is in a lot of difficulty. I think this has been a view for a number of years now. There are a variety of reasons for that, but countries are still trying to make some progress in the Doha Round. It's certainly not dead in any sense, but I think there's a view that we need to find a way to finish it in order to move on to other issues.
Well, one treaty that it really has a track record now is NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, I guess is what it's called. It came online back in the 90s. It was an agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. What was the genesis of NAFTA, and what have been the results of NAFTA as far as helping to create employment opportunities, and who are some of the winners and I would say losers, but which countries are gaining in using NAFTA?
Yeah. So NAFTA is what you would call a regional trade agreement, as you point out, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and was negotiated in 1994, just prior to the WTO coming into effect. And it has significantly reduced trade barriers between these three countries. And certainly, if you look at the trade data, what we've seen is a significant increase in trade and investment between these countries, because it's important to recognise that in some respects, NAFTA in fact goes further than the WTO, and this in fact is one of the benefits of regional or bilateral free trade agreements, which we can talk about more, which because they're amongst smaller numbers of countries who might have similar levels of ambition, allows for developing new rules and new market access opportunities that might not be possible in a WTO multilateral context. So certainly one area where NAFTA has gone a lot further is on the investment side, and investment is certainly an important part of the whole trading system. And so we've seen both increases in trade, increased investment, and overall increased economic integration amongst Mexico, the United States, and Canada. There's always been a debate about exactly how much employment NAFTA has created. It's hard to do a counterfactual at times to work out what it would have been like in the absence of NAFTA. But I think there's certainly a view that NAFTA has benefited both the United States, Canada, and Mexico from an employment perspective. What these trade agreements tend to do is, as I was saying previously, is lead to more efficient allocation of resources. So as barriers come down, particular industries do suffer, the ones that are unable to compete any longer, and so you do see that employment can rise in particular sectors. The idea being that resources should be allocated to those areas which are now either more competitive or have now got new market access opportunities as a result of these trade agreements. And so net overall, you expect to see increased employment, increased welfare, but what clearly is needed as a complement to this process of economic adjustment as a result of trade agreements is policies which can help that adjustment process, whether that is retraining and the like.
As I recall back during the debate on NAFTA, they had it on the fast track, as I believe, where you could not add amendments to it in the House and the Senate and the U.S. Congress. So you had to vote package up or down. But they came up with some side agreements on, I believe, on environmental regulations and on labor issues, because Canada and the United States, both the labor requirements as far as safety requirements and what have you, were higher than Mexico, and also with environmental regulations. What happened with those side agreements? Were they ever implemented? Are they implemented today? Are we actually focusing on some of these issues to maybe help Mexico to raise their requirements so that they do have better control over environmental degradation, or reduce environmental degradation, and also to improve the safety standards for workers?
No, so labour and environment has increasingly become an important part of trade negotiations, and was certainly part of the NAFTA. And when we look forward and look at the other trade agreements that the United States in particular has negotiated since then, we see a further development of commitments on environment and labour. And essentially the aim has been to make sure that trade liberalisation does not lead to a race to the bottom. It does not lead to the United States or any of its other FTA partners, whether it's the other NAFTA partners or other countries to which it is party to free trade agreements, lowering their environmental standards, lowering their labour standards in order to benefit or take advantage of the trade agreement. So you don't want the trade agreement sort of creating those types of adverse incentives. So what we see is generally commitments that countries won't do that they will not lower their labour and environmental standards. And often there is also increasingly more robust commitments to cooperate to in fact raise standards on labour and environment. So I'll give you a couple of examples. If we look at what's been happening most recently in trade agreements on these issues, what usually the United States seeks is, on the labour side, commitments to a variety of the International Labour Organization principles and conventions. So countries agree that they will have in their labour laws particular ILO principles such as right to organise, these types of issues, commitments on avoiding child labour and these types of issues. On the environment side, we see commitments to implement, ratify and a range of multilateral environmental agreements on things as diverse as biodiversity, protection of whales, trade in endangered species, these types of issues. So in fact, these trade agreements are becoming opportunities to also raise labour and environmental standards.
That's very interesting, especially, well, both sides are very interesting, but we look at the environmental situation today, and we see that the scientific reports are they're coming faster than the ice is melting in the Arctic area, to be quite honest. We see the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently came up with report number 5, indicating that they've, from their scientific studies, indicated that 95% of the climate change or warming, global warming, whatever you want to call it, is coming from humans. There's a debate on that to some degree, but I think most people are in agreement that the climate is changing for whatever reasons. And this, when we look at the rapid melting of the glaciers, we look at the seas rising, we look at desertification taking place, and we see that 97% of the climate scientists think that it's man-made, or human-made, I should say. That brings a whole new discussion into these trade agreements. How actively are the participants, I guess it depends from agreement to agreement, but how actively do they incorporate this information from the scientists talking about how the climate is changing into their discussions, and how important is that today?
So climate change, clearly a very important and complex issue with, and increasingly I think there's a recognition and understanding that in order to deal with the climate change challenge is going to require significant economic reform. So it's essentially in many respects an economic issue. And this is where I think trade agreements increasingly are seen as playing a role in supporting action on climate change. And so, for instance, what we do see is certainly in the United States, leadership on this issue in terms of trying to use trade agreements to support climate change action. So one example there is the progress that has been made, in fact, in getting countries to agree to reduce tariffs on what are called environmental or climate change goods and services. So the types of goods that might be used to, in fact, help governments and industry address climate change. So this might be trade in goods for renewable energy, in other sort of low emissions technologies and the like. And so by making them cheaper, it makes the costs of addressing climate change more effective. But there's a broad agenda out there on what possibly trade agreements could do to support climate change. Other topics that are under discussion at the moment include, for instance, reducing subsidies on fossil fuels, which is clearly creating a perverse incentive for more CO2 emissions than would otherwise be the case. Making sure that some action to reduce climate change, such as on renewable energy, maybe is not challengeable in the WTO context. There is some concern that, for instance, subsidies for renewable energy might be subject to WTO challenge. So there's discussion about, do we need to do something with the rules to make sure that that's not the case, because we would like to encourage that type of government behaviour. So there's a range of issues that's now making this trade and climate change agenda come together.
That's very interesting. I've read an article not long ago that indicated that something like $500 billion a year, there's $500 billion in subsidies to fossil fuel industries, for example, coal, oil, gas, natural gas, that type of thing. And the subsidies to the clean energy, the solar, the wind, are much lower. Is there any way to work out, perhaps understand why the subsidies are there to a large degree, but is there any way to legally help the clean energy components to maybe not get more subsidies, but at least be on that level playing field with the fossil fuels? Because it seems like fossil fuels have a tremendous advantage as far as they're keeping their prices down. And of course, their external cost also, with coal and with oil and with gas, the extra was clean energy alternatives on a level playing field?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's certainly where I think people are trying to head. So when you talk about the economic viability of renewable energy, I think what's understood is that that has to be done in a situation where we take into account the subsidies that are given to other energy sources. So you have to be making sure that you're comparing sources in effect accurately, and that also requires increasingly taking into account the externalities that you're talking about. So what really is the true cost of coal, electricity production from coal, for instance. So we need to have a sort of a concept, at least, of a carbon price to reflect the cost, in fact, of CO2 emissions, to more accurately make those assessments. So there's a range of sort of economic policy tools which seek to get at that. Some of that is talking about the reduction of fossil fuel subsidies and how do you actually account for that. Some of it is through carbon pricing and a variety of mechanisms for doing that as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, in the last minute or so, and this is a tough one, I realize you mentioned a race to the bottom. Mm-hmm. And all countries want foreign direct investment. They want companies to come in to create employment opportunities. Yeah. How can we balance that out a little more? Because you see that there's been a flight from some of the developed countries where the wages are $25 an hour going to some of the developing countries. Is there any way, and I know the developing countries need the employment, I'm not arguing that, yeah, but can you balance that out some way to make it, again, that level playing field, and maybe not a race to the bottom where companies just go where they're going to get cheap labor?
Yeah, so, you're always going to have wage differentials between, the developed world and the developing world. And, the decision that companies make about where to locate investment is going to depend on a range of factors, including the type of manufacturing we're talking about. So the manufacturing that sort of relies essentially on large amounts of cheap labor is never going to exist anymore in the United States. But the manufacturing that is more higher end, that relies on a more skilled workforce, should certainly be there's no reason that can't be located in developed countries like the United States. The other thing to remember is that when we look at wage differentials, we have to also take into account productivity differentials. For instance, if you look at China, where wages have gone up significantly, they are still lower than the United States, but productivity in the United States is significantly higher. So then the wage gap becomes significantly less. And then once you start factoring other very important variables for companies, such as being closer to the market, transportation infrastructure costs, then you start seeing how the United States can be competitive.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Josh Meltzer, these are very important. I'd hope we could get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think the TPP agreement, but we were not going to have time to do that today, but these are very important issues, and hopefully we'll have a chance to do that in the future. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Pleasure.
Thanks
a lot.
I am Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.